Welcome back. You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, Colin Piper. And this podcast deals with one of the greatest mysteries of human history. What is prayer all about? Patriarch, Chapter 5, Part 3. Abraham had watched the whole exchange with bewilderment and embarrassment, and now in the awkwardness of the aftermath, he was at a loss for words. He felt the need to apologize for the humiliation of a guest being addressed and, worse, contradicted by a woman. Yet this was no ordinary guest, but one who knew not only Sarah's name, but also Sarah's heart, and so somehow it seemed superfluous to apologize to him. Instead, he shifted rather awkwardly from foot to foot until he became aware that his body language was probably suggesting that his honoured guests had outstayed their welcome, which was, in fact, the last thing he wanted to communicate. It was the Lord who ultimately made the move, by beginning the salutations custom required of a departing guest. It was though already late afternoon, and Abraham was anxious for his guests. He would have preferred them to stay the night, but failing this, the very least he could offer was to walk with them and direct them on their way. As they went, Abraham became aware that he was walking a little ahead of his guests. And when he turned to wait for them to catch him up, he noticed they were engaged in an intense conversation. He was only able to catch the last line, in which the Lord asked a question, apparently in answer to a previous question or a query from one of the two other men. What he said, though, both excited and intrigued the patriarch. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? The appearance may have been that the Lord didn't mean to be overheard, but it was clear to Abraham at least that he was well aware that he'd been so. He turned towards Abraham and spoke tenderly, not as a guest, not even as a lord, but as a friend, with feeling and pride. Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. Abraham had obviously heard the Lord speak these words before, but never in this manner, and never ever to a third party like this. It was as though his inclusion in the group was being justified. But it soon became apparent that the justification wasn't based upon anything Abraham was, would be, or even would do. Rather, it was very much more profound and personal than that. For I have chosen him, said the Lord. And that, evidently, was the end of any arguments. Although the Lord did continue for the record, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised. And on this basis, Abraham understood that his inclusion in the group was unquestionably and unanimously accepted. But for what purpose? The path they were taking was too familiar to Abraham for him to take much notice of it, and in any case the conversation had so engrossed him he hadn't registered that while talking they'd walked onto the very vantage point he had regularly frequented these past few weeks. Each night he would sit here with his Lord, as he had done those years before on a not dissimilar crag far, far away. Now he stood there with his Lord, and as he did, he became aware of a sadness coming over his friends. The Lord was looking down into the valley below, and Abraham couldn't help but turn to follow his gaze and see what had so distressed him. When he saw it, though, he immediately understood. Often Abraham would sit up here looking down and wondering at the beauty and purity of creation. Then he would look further down and wonder again, no longer at beauty and purity, but depravity. Sadness would consume him, sadness so deep he would on occasions wonder where it came from and how he was capable of feeling emotions as strong as this. Now he knew. As he stood before his Lord, looking down upon the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he understood both where the feelings had come from and perhaps why now the Lord felt able to take him into his confidence. All the same, nothing could prepare Abraham for what he was about to hear and learn. Initially, it was the formality and solemnity of the exchanges which struck the Patriarch. It was as though the Lord had set up the court of heaven here on the cliff top to pass judgment on the world below, judgment to which he was to be privy. His credentials had been read out to the heavenly beings, and now he was accepted into the court. But in what capacity? At first Abraham thought he was purely and simply to be a witness, or more correctly, a spectator. This seemed a privilege enough for a human to sit in on the judgment of God. But soon it became apparent it would be more than that, and it occurred to Abraham that the sort of witness he was to be was much more than spectator. He was to participate in some manner, even give evidence, and that overwhelmed Abraham with a responsibility he had never felt before. The nearest occasion on which he'd felt anything approaching this responsibility was the last time he'd stood here looking out over a smouldering Sodom and Gomorrah. Then he was on his way to rescue its inhabitants. But now was he to be part of the judgment and damnation of the cities? The very thought alarmed Abraham. It was just too much. The cities stood for everything he was against, and they laughed at all he stood for. They were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They didn't help the poor and needy. He hated them and would gladly have seen them destroyed. Oh, a life that simple. But in their midst, clutched and held captive by some hideous strength, was at least one he loved, and with him a family for whom he felt responsible. Oh, Lot. He'd never understood his nephew and would-be son. He hadn't understood him in those early days of the frivolous youth, nor was he able to comprehend the sad memories he still carried of the broken man released from the bondage of Kedorlaomer. That day he'd watched the wretch return to another captor and taken away into the bondage which was Sodom. Abraham had seen very little of his nephew these past years since that disturbing day. Rarely had Lot emerged from the city, and absolutely never would Abraham venture in. Occasionally when passing he would see Lot near the gate, but it was a ghost of a man with whom he attempted conversation, pale in complexion, nervous in disposition, just so very sad and broken. Perhaps that was why, more than anything else, Abraham despised Sodom, for what it had done to his nephew. But ironically, it was because of his nephew that he would now plead its case. If the court of heaven had been called to order to pass judgment on the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he would be more than a witness. He felt obliged to be the counsel for the defence. Yet, to plead Sodom's cause, Abraham would need to be clearer of the charges against it, and for that he would need to know the mind of the Lord Most High. He turned his eyes back from Sodom to the Lord and tried to read his mind, only to be utterly shocked. He thought he knew the nature of the Lord's sadness, but was about to realize he only understood the tiniest parts. And as he did, he was also about to understand the nature of his God, his wrath and his compassion. The Lord sighed a deep sigh. It was almost a groan which was fairly audible and yet somehow seemed to resonate and echo through all the surrounding creation. It was a cry of pain in response to and in empathy and understanding with another cry of pain from roundabouts. Finally, he barely whispered, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great." And as he did, he shook his head and shocked his hearer. Just as the crimes of Sodom were personal to Abraham, so they were also to his Lord. This was no outrage against some law or standard, some accepted norm or practice. It was an outcry against someone and of someone which had reached the ear of the Lord. More than that, Abraham began to sense, in as far as it was an outcry against someone, it was an outcry against the Lord himself. It was deeply personal, and consequently the response was not cold, objective anger, but rather red, hot, passionate wrath. Oh, this was just too much for Abraham. All he'd learned of his Lord over these 30 years had taught him much of the holiness, the might, and compassion of his God. But never had he come to appreciate the implications of that so pure, powerful love. And now that he had, there was simply no time to process the thoughts. He was about to see wrath outworked against the towns and by association his nephew Lot. And the Lord continued, "Their sin is so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." The Lord who hears. Abraham couldn't stop his mind from going back to his son Ishmael. Of course he hears every cry of every person, and if so, there was hope. Surely he will hear the cries of any righteous in Sodom, and more, much more. He's not only the God who hears, but also the God who sees, the Lord who goes down and sees. Abraham marveled at the Lord, who didn't just sit in judgment, but stepped down to understand and feel. What sort of God is this, who knows without going, but goes anyway? In fact, in the event, he didn't go. Rather, the two companions with him went, and seemingly as prosecutors to gather evidence, leaving Abraham alone with his Lord. Alone to plead the case, if not for the towns, at least to cry out for the righteous of those towns. Surely the Lord would hear that plea. Warily, more warily than ever before, Abraham approached the Lord he thought he knew, but whose nature and heart he appeared only now to be discovering. Nervously, he now stood before him and between him and the cities below. Hesitantly, he addressed him. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" It was a genuine question. Abraham thought he knew the answer, but was realizing he knew so little of this God he'd communed with for so long. It was just too vague a question. He needed to be more specific. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? The Lord was listening to him, and he grew in confidence. "Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for 50 righteous people in it?" Still the Lord listened, and still Abraham's confidence grew. He now no longer questioned to seek the mind of God, but dared to reason to change the mind of God. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. And as the Lord continued to hear him, so he grew bolder and bolder in his argument. Far be it from you, Abraham repeated, much stronger now, and then with unprecedented strength of voice, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? As soon as he said it, he regretted it and feared he'd overstepped the mark. Who was he to tell the judge of all the earth how to do what is right? He could hardly believe what he'd said, and now waited, cowering emotionally, if not physically, breathlessly waiting the response. When it came, the response lacked any anger, argument, or explanation. It merely accepted what Abraham had said. If I find 50 people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for them. Abraham was very shocked to the core of his being. Had he just changed the mind of God? He really had no idea. The Lord had simply agreed to what he'd said, but what did it mean? All he could be certain of was that some confidence was beginning to return, some, though not all, and once more it was a tentative Abraham who addressed his Lord a second time. Now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I'm nothing but dust and ashes. Abraham paused for breath. He was finding it hard to get the words out, and as he did, he tried to measure his hearer. His father had taught him to read a man and to bid and counter-offer accordingly, but his father had never prepared him to negotiate with such a person as this. And if this was a negotiation, it was like none he'd ever engaged in before. Eventually, he decided not to ask too much, and even to phrase the little he requested as palatably as possible. What if the number is 5 less 50, let's say? Will you destroy the whole city because of just 5 people? Again, Abraham had no idea how the Lord would respond, and so waited for the mind of God to be revealed. It was one of those interminable waits of indeterminable durations. Such was the intensity of the listening and the significance of the hearing. If I find 45 there, I will not destroy it. Judgment had again been passed, and Abraham had again won his plea, but still he wasn't at all sure how. Had he changed the Lord's mind, or had he merely discovered it? In truth, he had no idea. He could only request again and wait to see what happened, so he again spoke up. What if only 40 are found there? This time there was no special pleading, no justification or explanation of his case. He had simply asked, and the Lord simply answered. For the sake of 40, I will not do it. It was the simplicity of the Lord's answer which struck Abraham. He still had not come to terms with who or what he was addressing, but in any case he turned his mind to the manner of dialogue. Abraham had at first thought he was putting the case for the defence, but now he was less sure. There was certainly little debate. Then he thought he might be negotiating with the Lord and even daring to change his mind, but again he wasn't so sure anymore. Negotiations involved haggling, with one party making an offer and the other a counter-offer. The Lord didn't appear to be negotiating so much as agreeing to Abraham's request. Abraham decided there was only one way of finding out just what was going on, and he spoke once more. His request this time was humbly phrased, but bolder and more demanding than any yet. May the Lord not be angry. Let me speak. Abraham paused briefly, not so much as to gain the permission he requested, but to summon the courage to ask the question. What if only 30 can be found there? It was actually a shrewd move by the trader. Maybe the Lord would now be forced to reveal more of his hand. Back in if he'd been offered a treasure for, let's say, 40 shekels of silver, he might offer 30, safe in the knowledge that the seller would probably come back and request 35. Now, in all honesty, he would probably have paid 35 in any case, but if he'd offered that much, he might have been forced to pay more. Such were the ways of the world when haggling over the things of the world, but such, it appeared, were not the ways of the Lord when determining the things of God. I will not do it if I find 30 there. Then Abraham knew. He wasn't involved in a negotiated settlement. It was just too marvelous to comprehend. Could the Lord just be agreeing to whatever he said? And if so, why? He simply didn't know. Never before in 30 years had he spoken with his Lord like this. Did he really have such influence over the mind of God, which he'd sought on and off for so long? And if so, what did this really mean for him, his Lord, and right now for the likes of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah who partied on below, ignorant of the fact that their very lives were being held in the balance above them? With what Abraham now considered to be the right measure of humility and boldness, deference and confidence, he tried again. Now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 could be found there? For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. The question Abraham asked was answered by what the Lord said, but the bigger unasked question still wasn't. He really had no idea whether he was changing the Lord's mind or merely discovering it. Either way, he struggled to come to terms with what was going on. And more than all that, he struggled to fathom the Lord before whom he stood. 30 years he'd sought him, and more been sought by him. There'd been times of intimacy and challenge, of joy and tears, of struggle and peace, of revelation and silence. And yet it was as though the journey had only just begun. In the past few minutes, Abraham had discovered more about his Lord than in the past few decades. And his biggest discovery was that there was so much more to know. How could he know so little about one he thought he knew so well? What he had thought he knew, he now realized he'd only just begun to understand. For instance, the Lord's cry out over the outcry of Sodom. It both comforted and disturbed Abraham. This was a terrifying passion. It burned with love and anger. It demanded to go and see, to know, to feel, to stand in the midst of pain, but also demanded judgment, wrath. Perhaps for Abraham, the most unsettling aspect of the Lord's passion, though, was its control. For all the depth of feeling, the Lord answered him straightforwardly. They talked about the destruction of two cities in the same manner of purchasing grain. And still nothing could deny the depth of feeling, which was what moved Abraham and overwhelmed him the most. Never at any time had he appreciated the true consequences of the Lord's righteous anger as he did today. But with this understanding came another, even more extraordinary still. The Lord's, judge of heaven and earth, was the same Lord whose very nature was to have mercy. Abraham could never have grasped the depth of this compassion and mercy without first knowing the depth of his wrath. But now as he stood with his Lord looking down on Sodom, he saw it through the Lord's eyes and would never be able to see it any other way again. He felt a level of pain which made his previous feelings towards the city look like mild irritations. And then he felt a love, an overwhelming love. Had he really presumed to consider himself the counsel for the defense before the God of such love? What was his concern before the Lord's? And yet, he needed to find out for sure whether he was influencing the Lord's decision or just discovering the extent of his compassion. Abraham resolved to ask just one more question. Just one more. He began again, humbly and deliberately. May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just one more time. Again he paused, but again it was not so much to give the Lord chance to deny him the opportunity to speak. He knew by now he would be allowed to speak. He simply didn't know what to ask. What if... Could a God who was so holy really be persuaded to overlook such an outcry as the one from Sodom and Gomorrah? Even suggesting it seemed an affront to Abraham. Any confidence he'd had was by now sapping away from him. What if only what? Only one? Surely there had to be one. Surely one righteous man was enough to save all. But how could that be? How could the Lord overlook the sin of a depraved world for just one righteous man? It couldn't be. Just to suggest it was an insult, it was ridiculous. Or was it? Abraham looked at his Lord and knew that what was ridiculous to anyone else wasn't ridiculous to him. He knew it. Oh, but could he confess it? And with that he knew the truth. He wasn't changing the mind of God, just discovering and declaring it. Somehow his acceptance of it had a power and authority in the courtroom of God, although he didn't know how. And perhaps for this reason, he lost the confidence to speak out what he so wanted to declare and believe. What if only... Once more, courage failed him. He'd come so far, but just daren't press on to the end. It was too far. Instead, the trader split the difference and compromised. What if only 10 can be found there? With a sadness, the Lord answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And then he left. Abraham left too, and returned to Mamre, exhausted and yet elated. He had surely done enough to save his nephew, but more than that, had done the improbable, if not the impossible. He'd stood before God and been a part of the judgment of the earth. He'd spoken out the mind of his Lord, and now he was casually walking home to his tent to wash, eat a little of what his friends had left behind, and prepare for bed. The incongruity of it all was just too much, and Abraham found himself laughing as he lay down on his bed, and the incongruity of laughing at things like this just made him laugh all the more. And then he sensed her there and slowly stopped laughing. In the midst of all else, he had forgotten her. He'd forgotten the exchange earlier in the day, and now she stood at the foot of his bed, obviously wondering at his mood. Abraham's mind now went back to the promises of the Lord earlier in the day, and then on to all he'd experienced of that Lord on the cliffs overlooking Sodom, and faith rose in his heart. He opened his bed to Sarah and took her in. For the first time in many, many years, he took her in love. And for the first time in longer still, in faith. The sort of faith which bears fruit. That night, he would rest in peace, secure in the promises of God for himself, Sarah, and Lot. That night, Abraham was confident all was well with the world. The following morning, though, his confidence would be shattered.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.